practices in my life since then that they outweigh the profoundly disturbing
Yeah.
incidents that occurred.
All right. We are live on Facebook and live on YouTube now. And Sean, this is Sean.
Evening social
John.
media.
Hi, John.
How you doing, John? Thanks for joining us. It's going to be a fun open conversation tonight. I think we'll have a good group. Already a lot of people in the waiting room. We're going to get
Good.
our music started in here in just a second. We'll let everybody in. We'll do our little song and dance, and then we'll dive right in. So thanks again.
I didn't know I was going to have to dance. Gee,
Yeah,
that's
come on. I hope you
okay.
practiced.
A little jig.
Okay.
All right, here we go.
Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Good to see everybody again. This is the Veterans Breakfast Club. I'm Todd DiPastino. And once again, it's Monday night, and here we are talking with veterans about all things related to the veterans community, the military community. I'm not a veteran, neither is Sean Hall. Hello, Sean. How are you?
Evening, everybody. It's good to see you all.
And but we work with the Veterans Breakfast Club to kind of lead these conversations where we encourage veterans and others who are related to the military community to share a story or two about what they did, what they experienced, what they saw. And we feel that it helps to connect veterans to the public, to the community, and it helps educate and inspire people like me. So, open conversation. We do that like once a month. And that means you guys can bring topics, bring up subjects that you'd like to discuss, keep it civil, keep it mostly clean. Colonel Washabaugh, would you say what's the rating that we're looking for? PG-13, would you say? Brad, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Yeah, we're looking for something that you could stay up past 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock at night and maybe see, but still be clean, No derogatory comments against Marines.
Oh my gosh. Then we're
Yeah.
shutting down the show now.
Yeah. And we could challenge everybody to do the flag quiz that's on the bulletin today. That was quite challenging.
Oh, I'll pull up that link.
Yeah.
That flag quiz was unbelievable, Brad. I mean,
Yeah.
I took your flag quiz because it was drawn from a quiz that you did for your beloved family.
Right.
For I think Memorial Day last year.
Right.
And put it up on the internet. And boy, I made the quiz and I got a lot of questions wrong. It's complicated.
I did not score 100% myself, I'll have to admit.
What questions did you miss?
It's that tough one about that flag hanging vertically on the street, which way it should face, east, west, north, south.
Yes.
I mean, that's one that's not well known.
It's not well known and it's not well stated because it says, like, from the flag's perspective, where is the canton with the stars, on the right or on the left?
Right.
Like, from the flag's perspective.
And I did tell you about the change that DOD now is allowed the flag to be displayed horizontally at sporting events. That was a change. They came out in January.
So it is now allowed to be held horizontally.
At sporting events, yes, but not from parachutists.
Yes.
Skydivers.
Do you approve of the change, allowing the flag to be held horizontally?
Well, it really wasn't being followed anyway, and like you said in the quiz, the danger is letting it fall to the ground, or
right.
Those things happen so quickly. They unfurled and they furled it back up. It's you don't want to see it hit the ground, of course, and the chances of it happening,
yes,
are likely.
And people should know Colonel Brad Washabaugh, retired Marine. How many years in the Marine Corps, Brad?
29, Todd.
29 years, and you are one of the biggest, you're a board member of the Veterans Breakfast Club, right. And you're one of the biggest sticklers for flag etiquette and rule following I've ever met.
Yeah, well, thank you.
So you're And we're going to move on, I promise you, but we're having this conversation because, of course, Saturday is Flag Day, June 14th, also the 250th birthday of the United States Army. And Brad, you are the kind of person where if you're a neighbor of Brad Washabaugh and you have a flag outside your house and it, after a while gets maybe tattered or not looking so bright, you might receive a friendly letter in your mailbox from your neighbor, Brad Washabaugh,
That's right.
who
And
has a helpful suggestion to buy a new flag.
yeah, I like to warn everybody in Pittsburgh, I do have a deputy that's been appointed. His name is Don Nemchek. I don't know whether he's on tonight, but
Oh, yes.
he's already informed me of several actions he's taken for faded and torn flags. And he's been he's been one of my best deputies, and I'm always looking to deputize others. So my wife rolls her eyes, when we drive past the house, and I'll go running the next day with a note in my hand and put it in the mailbox and then follow up the next week to see whether the violation's been corrected or not.
Don is on tonight. He's unmuted.
Don, my deputy, go ahead. Tell us some good word.
Well, thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. It's an honor to be a deputy. And I also have a strong lieutenant. My wife in the passenger seat keeps an eagle eye out while I'm watching the road. So if there's any flags that are tattered or torn, I've also authored a letter, a very polite letter, just asking the homeowner to change the flag properly, dispose of it. And if they need my help, I'll help them dispose of it in the proper way. So it's an honor to do that. I'm proud of how we've cleaned up our neighborhood a little bit. Didn't take much. We have a lot of flags out. This is a very patriotic neighborhood in the Still Valley. So it's my honor to do that, and I thank you for recognizing me this evening.
Well, thank you, Don. I'm sure we have some other potential volunteers out there as deputy. Just send me an email and I'll get all the necessary paperwork done and get you deputized in your hometowns.
Oh,
But
right.
Do you have to have a particular score on the trivia quiz before you can be deputized?
Well, there
Well,
is,
I have to. Excuse me for interrupting, but I have to admit I took the flag test today and I failed miserably. I was in the 50 percentile, and I have to really work on it. I'm waiting for Brad to order me some extra duty, and I'm going to have to pay the price for being in the dark about flag etiquette.
Yeah,
well, it's once you're aware, as you know, Todd, once you're aware and you start looking around, you'll see plenty of, and people just don't know. I mean, all kidding aside, it's all good natured, but it's just good this time of year to remind everybody about flag etiquette because I really believe, it's a patriotic thing to do to fly the flag and for what it represents, all the great things. But it's a symbol, it's a very important symbol, and it's something to be revered and treated properly. And I respect people that fly it properly, and those that don't, maybe they don't really know. So it's just a matter of using some tact, which I'm open to learning some more from you, Todd, about tact, because I'm rather direct sometimes.
No, you are extremely tactful. Thank you very much, Brad. This is if we want to talk about the flag, I think we could later on. Also, I do want to welcome a guest, Air Force veteran who has joined us, who hasn't talked much, I think, in our live streams, but he did submit and sit to a long interview with our own Larry Woods several years ago. And he also sent me, at my request, a kind of a memoir of his service because I asked him about his service because I just found it was so fascinating. This is John Miller. Hello, John. How are you?
Hi, Todd. Thank you.
John, where do you live?
Live in a little town, Fairfield, Iowa, southeast corner of Iowa.
Southeast corner of Iowa.
Right.
And what caught my attention, John, is first of all, you were United States Air Force Academy graduate, class of 1969.
Right.
And you wanted to be a pilot, I believe.
Right.
Why else would you go to the Air Force, right?
Right. Indeed.
That's right. And but you had a really interesting job that I'd never heard of before. You were at Utapao Air Force Base Royal Air Force Base in Thailand in the early 1970s, and you taught a course on race relations.
Indeed.
And
Right.
I had never heard of the Defense Race Relations Institute, which trained people like you to deal with the huge problem of racial conflict in the military toward the end of the Vietnam War.
Right.
And you said that the coursework that you were trained to lead really did help in kind of diffusing racial tensions. And I just thought, boy, what an interesting part of history that I wasn't aware of, and we could probably learn much from today. So could you just tell us a little bit, first of all, your background and how you ended up going to the Air Force Academy?
Certainly, Todd. So thank you for the opportunity. So born and raised in Wyndham, Minnesota, a very small town, about 3,000 people. It's where my mother and her parents had a farm outside of town, and I used to love to go to that farm as a kid. The town was entirely composed of white folks. The only time, I believe, until I moved to Minneapolis when I was 12, my dad's job was downsized and we had to move. Until I was 12, the only black person I believe I ever saw was a missionary from Tanganyika, which is now Tanzania. And Eli Rehema Mwanga was his name. I'll never forget him. And he taught us a couple of songs from his native culture. And someplace I have a photo of him in one of my old kid photo albums. So he was it. And very pleasant interaction, very pleasant memory of that. So then I went to the Air Force Academy, and in '65, after spending 6 years in Minneapolis at a different high school, even thinking about that high school, I do not recall people of color at the high school. I could be wrong, but I do not recall that. So I moved to the Air Force Academy. I say I moved. I was accepted there. '65. And lo and behold, we had people of color that were cadets there. And on one occasion, I remember almost every black cadet was in the room that I shared at that point with a black roommate of mine, Kenny Stevenson. And we've actually been in touch fairly recently. He was stationed at Utapau as a pilot when I was doing my race relations program. And it was an unusual experience to be in a room with about 8 or 9 black cadets. I was the only white guy. And looking back on it, I'm kind of surprised I wasn't a little more nervous than I recall being. But anyway, it was an introduction to the black community, at least at the academy. And then as I neared graduation, I was still strongly motivated to become a pilot. I had the good fortune of having a brother, sadly just recently passed last August, but he was in the class of '67. And he came back to the academy on a cross-country mission in '68 when he was in the 1 year of training. Very much to my surprise, he said, "I think you should think twice about going to pilot training." He was a huge role model influence for me at the time. Long story short, I did not go to the full pilot training. I had the 30 hours at the academy in the T-41. As a result of that decision, I had several different AFSC duties, when the Army calls them MOS, in my 5 years of active duty. One was a manpower job, staffing job, which was boring as hell for about 18 months. Then I got into the information office, much more interesting, for about 10 months. And then this new program arises in 1972 of the race relations. And I heard about it and I thought, that sounds like something where I could really make a difference, besides learning a lot. So I volunteered for it, got accepted, and I spent my last 30 months then in the Air Force in that program. And
here's
learning
the picture. I'm
7
sorry.
weeks of.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt you here, John, but here's a picture, I think, of the Defense Race Relations Institute, which was at Patrick Air Force Base.
It was indeed, yeah, the east coast of Africa there. And each class was, like I say, 7 weeks. We had about 35 or so students from all branches of the military in each class. And, we grilled each other pretty heavily and learned a hell of a lot. Spent a weekend in Miami in the Black ghetto community, familiarizing ourselves with that. And I graduated with, opening my eyes, and did the program then at Kelly Air Force Base for about, 8 months. And then I got transferred to Utapau, where I finished my last 500 days of duty there, and had the great benefit of serving at both bases with the first base, Kelly, with a black Tech Sergeant, Johnny James, and a young Staff Sergeant, Ramon Hernandez. Recently been in touch with Ramon. Johnny has passed on, sadly, about 2-3 years ago. And in Thailand, then, with another black NCO, Tech Sergeant James Dickinson, and a Chicano Tech Sergeant Roman Quintana, who I just, again, had contact with, last week. So great to renew our relationship. Anyway, he lives in Texas, born and raised in Texas. And he and Dick, we called each other brothers, Brother Dick, Brother John, Brother Roman. And I tell you, you could not tell any rank distinction between us. I was the captain in charge of the program, but we treated each other with such respect and learned so much from each other. And like I shared with you, Todd, before the program started, I was really pleased that we were able to bring the students in on Monday morning and 3.5 hours per day. By Friday, Monday, nobody wanted to be there. Nobody. By Friday, we were able, on anonymous critiques, to have them register a 97% effectiveness in terms of building human relations. And I tell you, I have never had a more stressful job in my life, nor one that was so gratifying. Probably it was inevitable that the two go together.
Yeah, I think so.
And I still have such fond memories of working with such fine NCOs as I had the privilege of doing, and learning so much from them, and communicating so much to the students. I mean, it was so needed, so needed.
And that's it, John, is I think a lot of the veterans here tonight might remember that time in the late 60s, early 70s, probably through the mid 70s, when race relations in the country were terrible.
Absolutely.
But in the
Yeah.
military, really bad and really destructive of morale. I think it inhibited the fighting effectiveness of, the U.S. military in Vietnam.
Certainly.
And I think it helped to promote the idea of an all-volunteer force, I believe.
Sure.
So some of our people here, some of the folks who are on here, Vietnam veterans especially, might chime in. Were you aware, I suppose, of all the things that have been taking place in the military when you started going into DRRI?
When we had our class, the first session of the class, there was a gentleman named Donald Miller who was from the Department of Defense who spoke to us, and he informed us that there had been a number of incidents of violent outbreaks on quite a few different bases, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, that led the DOD to make the decision to initiate this program. It was purely in response to the severe, lousy relations that we had between the different minorities and the white majority on these bases. So, I mean, it was like a matter of, we have to do something. Let's give this a try.
What was the ratio of, service members of color versus white service members who were in these classes, taking these classes with you?
My recollection is that it was about an equal divide. Kind of reflected the two race relations teams that I served on, that each one composed of three, myself and Chicano and African American. So I think it was probably a little bit more heavily towards the minority, but yeah, I would say like 60-40 probably. Minority, Caucasian.
Can you sum up what these students learned about each other and maybe learned about themselves? Because
Wow, gee,
I know. Hey, I
how
don't
much time do we have?
I don't ask easy questions here, John. I know.
I tell you, Johnny James, the tech sergeant at Kelly that I worked with, he and I drove from Kelly in my pickup truck with a white girlfriend of mine across the Deep South to go to the class. She was going to see some friends in Virginia, and I was bringing her as far as Florida. We're going through the Deep South, and Johnny was very uncomfortable with having a white woman being in the pickup with a white man and himself. I had no idea that it was an issue, and so even Johnny at Kelly was, before we went to the RRI, he was telling people, we would go around to units on base, and he would say, I mean, he was treated, quite well in the military. He didn't have any profound incidents of racism. He said, I think that we don't so much have a race problem as we have a human relations problem. Okay? We both went through the 7 weeks of DRRI. About the 5th week or so, we saw about a 3 or 4 hour segment called Montgomery to Memphis, which was a summary of the profound racism and violence and such that the mostly blacks endured in the Deep South, mostly, that were protesting against the Jim Crow laws. Mm-hmm. The supposedly separate but equal. And, under the guidance of Martin Luther King, of course. And what happened, it breaks my heart today to remember watching that. And I had no idea that it was, when I grew up in Minnesota in the earlier 60s, I was totally unaware of these protests, the violence that involved, and killings and so forth, the famous killings of some of the protesters and the freedom riders burning the buses and so forth. I mean, we saw it all. And like I say, in particular, one afternoon of about 3.5 or 4 hours, we came out of the movie room. Johnny was in tears. I think everybody was in tears. And he never again said, we have a human relations problem. It was, we have a racial problem here. We have racism that is active and needs to be dealt with. And it really opened everybody's eyes to the reality. And, don't sugarcoat it. Speak the truth and go out and educate and do what you can. And so we would put a lot of the attendees into, role play exercises. Mm-hmm. I might have written that up. I think I maybe wrote it up in what I shared with you, Todd. But, we would have a senior white NCO tell the group of students, there'd be like 20 or 22 students in our classroom, and we would ask him to tell us how he identifies with the rebel flag as a Southern man raised in, Alabama, Georgia, wherever. And he would talk about its meaning. And then we would have a young black airman tell the group the meaning of the Black Power sign, or of the handshake that's called the DAP that blacks exchange with each other on the base a lot. He would explain that. Well, as you might imagine, we would then reverse roles. Have the senior white NCO talk about how he thought so highly of the power sign or of the DAP, and of the young black airman, and we would have him talk about rebel flag, how deep its meaning was for him.
Right.
Well, guess what? In doing that, we did it most every class. I never had a black airman refuse to speak about the rebel flag. They grew up with it. They knew it.
John, I think that, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I had on several occasions, I had the senior white NCO refuse. He would not speak about how highly he regarded the power sign or the DAP or whatever. So, I mean, you could tell from that where the brunt of the issue of the problem lies, with those folks that had grown up in as I said, the Jim Crow South especially. And the role that they learned of filled by blacks and Chicanos, and the role that they learned was filled by whites. And it was not pretty.
And
A lot of people don't know that Roman would tell me when he grew up in South Texas that there were the same for blacks and whites was true for Chicanos, that they had a separate entrance to the movie theater and so forth. I was shocked. I had no idea that was the case.
Ron Giunta, you put something here in the chat, I believe, about the social action. I keep on calling it an MOS. What is it called in the Air Force again?
AFSC, Air Force Specialty Code.
Okay, Air Force Specialty Code. Ron, you had the same specialty as John.
No, I didn't have the same specialty. I just had friends who were in that specialty when I was in the military. But my question was, did the social actions branch at the base level exist, John, when you were in the Air Force? Because I know it was there in 1980 whenever I joined the Air National Guard.
Right. It was indeed. That's how my first entry into the program in 1972 at Kelly was into the social actions office. We had a chief of it, then we had an equal opportunity. I think it was an NCO. And then we had our race relations team of 3 of us. And there was also a drug abuse component. So drug abuse, equal opportunity, race relations, those were the 3 that were under the social actions, right?
Yes.
Okay, can you say that again? So there was an Office of Social Actions.
Right.
It still exists. And at that time, it was race relations, drug abuse, and what else?
Equal opportunity.
And equal opportunity. Okay.
Because of that, the equal opportunity handled the cases of discrimination. We, as race relations personnel, we did not actively handle cases of discrimination. We reported, we shared experiences, it was the individual attitude that we were dealing with. We were not dealing with the legal ramifications.
Right. So interesting. Let's see. Greg Yost, you put something in the chat here. Did you said you have a way oversimplifying question?
Was John in the first class?
There were some discussions, some anecdotal and even sort of supported by evidence, indicates that prior to April 4th, 1968, sort of the race relations in Vietnam were sort of, we're all in this together. A sergeant and a private and an officer would sort of all sit there and say, hey, we're on the same team. April 4th, 1968 was the Martin Luther King assassination, followed by the riots. And a lot of white soldiers blamed the blacks for the riots, and a lot of blacks blamed the assassination of Martin Luther King on tolerated white supremacy, etc. So I don't know. This is sort of a before and after question. Was anyone there during that time and saw a difference between before his assassination and after? Just a thought. Some research supports that that was something of not quite a watershed moment, but something of a turning point.
John?
Oh, I thought he was asking everybody. So yeah, well, I was at the Air Force Academy at that time, and Greg, and like I said, there were about 8 or 9 black cadets in the entire cadet wing of almost 4,000 of us. So So it was not something that was ever spoken about. I'll tell you, with one exception. In other words, we were pretty shielded from it, except a couple, 2 years after was it 2 years? Yeah, about 2.5 years after I got out. I'm sure some of you remember Dick Gregory, originally a kind of a comedian type of personage. He became very active in the civil rights movement. I believe he marched with King a few times, and he may have been at the '63 March on Washington. I'm not sure of that. Anyway, long story short, there was a group of black cadets at the academy that asked if they could invite him to speak at the academy to the cadets. So January 1972, he gave a good more than an hour lecture. And I no longer recall how, but somehow when I was at Kelly starting to teach the program, somehow I acquired a copy of that, a reel-to-reel taped copy of it, which we took and condensed down to about a 35-minute broadcast. And we used to use that in every single class of ours. And it was among the most powerful tools that we had. I remember one senior officer at Utapau was rather shocked to hear it. And I remember in class, he said, do you have permission to use this in class? And I said, yes, sir, we do. God bless the chain of command. So we had some very controversial components to it like that, but they were, I think, among the most effective in educating. I mean, Dick Gregory himself said that he opened his talk by saying, I'm surprised I was invited to speak at the Air Force Academy. He said, because most people know my views on the military. So, but he said, on the other hand, anytime I can be invited to speak at a military academy, this was during the days of President Nixon. He said, and Pat Nixon can go to Africa and put on a dashiki and dance the Watusi. He said, there is plenty of hope for everyone. That's how he broke the ice on his talk.
Joe Griffiths. I want to go to Joe and then Scott and then Nancy. Joe, how are you?
Hello, Sean and Todd. Very good. Another good subject. I'm going to take a little different spin on this. I did not see, and I was in Vietnam from 67 to 68 during the Tet Offensive. I drank out of Black and Hispanic canteens, shared their food, read their letters from home. I did not witness one bit of discrimination except from the federal government, because Mr. Miller, I don't know if you'll agree with me or not, but if you were Hispanic, if you were African American, if you were Jewish, if you were a Native American Indian, if you were an Asian, and you did the same act as a Medal of Honor recipient, you didn't get the Medal of Honor. And if to prove this discrimination so bad that one of the past presidents just changed the law that in order to upgrade a Silver Star or an Air Force Cross, a Bronze Star for Valor, to the Medal of Honor or to a higher medal, using discrimination, you have to have one new piece of evidence to open your file up in the Pentagon to be elevated. There is a group, African Americans, Hispanics, like I said, can now use that discrimination. So I didn't see the discrimination, Todd and Sean, with our veterans. I saw it with the people that ran our government that were awarding medals. And I got to tell you something. We have a young guy from Medicine High School, Laurel Blevitt. His last week in Vietnam, he should get 2 Medal of Honors, but he was Black. And I'm not afraid of saying it. And I'm white. I'm not afraid of saying, when we were soldiers on the field, I don't care who you were, what nationality, whatever. If you did an action that deserved the Medal of Honor, you should have gotten it. And all you got to do is look how many Jewish or how many African American Medal of Honor recipients we have today. And that is, to me, that's the biggest injustice. And that's all I got to say.
And Joe, the other thing, I think you've said this in other programs we've had, and I've certainly heard it time and again from so many veterans over so many years, that when you were in the field, when you were in combat, there was no discrimination. There was no discriminating.
No, actually, I tell everybody we all looked alike. We all wore the same uniforms. We all had a tan, and we all looked alike.
And plenty of veterans have said, like, no, all the problems took place in the rear. All the problems took place in the garrison. All the problems took place in the bases back home. But in Vietnam, when we were in combat or in trouble, there was no conflict.
Not at all.
Scott Masters.
Yeah. Hi, John. This is really, really interesting. I'm a high school teacher. I just actually spent a big part of the day today marking exams. And one of the big questions for my American history class was about the state of race relations. And I got to say, I read some pretty sobering and interesting things from a lot of the students. I was curious if you were in the first class to go through this kind of training. And I was wondering if you did, I put my question in the chat, if you did human resource type programs for units back then, if it was something people had to do, if it was voluntary.
Yeah, it was a mandatory. Good question, Scott. Thank you. It was a mandatory 18-hour program. It was intended that everyone complete it. However, we were woefully understaffed and could not accomplish that. And I was in, I believe there was a pilot program to test out the DRI curriculum. And then I believe that there was a first program in early 1972. And I believe we were in the second class of April to May of 72. So I appreciated that because I think it was fresh enough that there was a lot of openness to ideas and options and so forth, and so that it was not rigidified and cut in stone and so forth. I kind of doubt that later classes actually spend a weekend in the Miami ghetto, for example. I don't know that for a fact, but that was very generous of the instructors to provide us with that kind of experience.
Nancy Smoyer, how are things in Fairbanks, Alaska?
They're sunny, finally,
Very good.
for our 23 hours or 4 hours of daylight.
Right.
So I'm responding to Greg's question about things changing with when Martin Luther King was killed. I was at Pucci during that time, and I have a very small incident. We were serving chow in one of the lines, and typically we would talk to everybody who went through. We'd say something to them. Well, one black man came through and he looked at me, and I can't remember, there wasn't anything in particular as to the way he looked at me, but he looked at me and I thought, I just turned the spoon around that I was serving with and gave it to him. He served himself, gave it back to me, and went on. And I just thought it was a very interesting little incident. And then I also wanted to mention that months before this, there was a donut dolly, and this was in on K, and she was from Texas. She learned the dap. Oh my goodness, it was wonderful. And she would go up to a bunch of black guys sitting around and dap with them. And they loved it. They really got a charge out of that. And then she'd chat with them with her Texan Southern accent. And so I never experienced any negativity, that one tiny little incident.
And Al Smith, who was a platoon leader in Vietnam, also said in 67, 68, you didn't experience or see any discrimination as a platoon leader. And I'm going to ask you to expand on that a little bit. But first, Dixon, I don't recall you seeing on our program before. It's good to thank you for joining us.
I'm an FNG.
You're an FNG. That's right. What is your first name? Is your first name Dixon?
Bill.
You're Bill Dixon.
I was in Vietnam 67, 68, little thing called Tet going on. But I think sometimes we forget that all of us who served in Vietnam are a micronism of what was going on in the United States. Because of the 1 year tour, it wasn't that you had a person living in a vacuum, because what they had went through back in the United States, they carried it with them quite often there. I had a friend I was in a headquarters company, small group. One of the guys there that I was friends with was black, and he complained sometimes. It changed after Martin Luther King. There was a kind of a unseen, unspoken wall between us after Martin Luther King, but he complained about some racial problems, and I had never seen them. But then again, being white, I wouldn't have looked for them where he saw them. So it's hard for us sometimes as a white to see the discrimination that they saw. I mean, I grew up in the South with there were separate water fountains. I never had a black go to school with me. I worked in tobacco fields with field hands and so forth. But in Vietnam, it was basically the same thing that was going on back in the United States. But there was a change that you couldn't see, but you could feel after Martin Luther King's assassination.
Mhm.
Came over with all of it.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Bill.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us. What unit were you with?
159 Engineer Group, headquarters company, part of the Engineer Brigade. I was at Long Bend.
At Long Bend. Okay.
53,000 of us at the time I was there.
I was going to say that's a small city or a large city.
Well, it was bigger than my hometown.
Where was your hometown?
My hometown was Wilson, North Carolina. It's right on 95, but you're going north and south. I presently live in Riverview, Florida, about 30 minutes out of Tampa. But back in those days, my hometown was the world's largest bright leaf tobacco market. And I know that they kept industry out for a long time because it would hire the tobacco heads and give them a full-time job. So they couldn't do that. They had to make sure that they kept industry out. So just have somebody bring tobacco in until it got so mechanical. It's a lot less work.
Thank you so much for joining us, Bill. That is great. And I want to come back to you about something else, but first I want to go to Al. Al Smith, among the challenges that you face as a platoon leader in Vietnam, dealing with racial conflict was not one of them.
None at all. None at all. My radio man was Jake was black. I never thought of him as black. He was my radio man. We were all there to watch out for each other, and if we had to die for the other person, we die for the other person. It may have changed. I guess it did change hearing from everyone tonight. Although I was there after Martin Luther King was assassinated, and I didn't see a change. Now, granted, I was born and raised in inner city New York, so some of my best friends were black, some were Hispanic, whatever. So, I mean, black, white, gray, I just blend with whatever. Maybe, I don't know if that had any factor, but I just never saw any of it. I don't know. This is why some of the comments tonight really set me back. And when people would say, well, what was one of the things you admire about the military? I said, there's no racism. You know, you get off the bus at basic training, and I don't care if you're black, Hispanic, or whatever, you quickly become green, and you get no favors from your drill sergeant or whatever from the start to the finish. I hope it's still the same way today.
Yeah. Thank you, Al. Jerry Augustine, how about you?
Yeah, I was in the first draft in 1965, actually 60 years ago. This month, I was drafted. I was 19. And then, of course, I ended up in Vietnam in 66 and served 66 and 67 in combat. And I shared my foxholes with black fellows, and I never had a problem. And if you look in my book, there's a lot of pictures with me and the black fellows together. And that's the way it was for me.
And I should remark that you have a new book out. I'm going to put a link to it here.
Oh, yeah.
For people to share, and we could talk about that in a little bit. I do want to make the observation, I think the obvious observation, that so far this has been a conversation mostly with white people, and we haven't had a Black veteran chime in with their experiences. I think it would enrich the conversation if we had. So it's there's an asymmetrical conversation. When I hear, Al, about your experiences and Jerry in Vietnam in the mid 1960s, there's a voice in my head that makes me say that you'll laugh at because it's such a ridiculous thing to say. But those were the good years in Vietnam, I think. 65, 66, 67, even maybe 68. And you've got to understand where I'm coming from. Because then I'll look at a company commander like Rick Weber, who served in 70, 71. And just to know the kind of, not only racial conflict, of course, that existed then in Vietnam, the problems with morale as the troops drew down, the problems with drugs, the counterculture, as Bill Dixon said so eloquently, I think, these people are coming into Vietnam with a whole background. And some of them by 1971, they were converted by the counterculture and then found themselves in the army and in Vietnam. And I don't know how company commanders like Rick Weber had dealt with that. It seems to me an impossible job. Rick, did you encounter or see racial conflict in Vietnam?
Not in the field. The best company officer I ever worked with was a Black captain. I would say he's the best. And every white guy would follow him because he was good. My best trooper in the field was a full-blooded Apache Indian. I called him Chief, and because he was the chief. He was the most amazing individual I've ever worked with. To answer your question, in the field, sergeants, when we got new people, we kind of broke them up a little bit, tried to pair them up, and no. The only time we ever had any, differences was we came in, music, stuff like that, until my last assignment. I was a company commander of a headquarters company. And that was the old Wild West. I lost more people. When I say lost more people in the 2 months that I was company commander of a headquarters company in the rear with drug overdoses and shootings than I did my 12 months in the field. It was just crazy because that's where the problem was. These gentlemen, and I call them gentlemen, they didn't have enough to do, and drugs were rampant, and that's where the real problems were between blacks and whites, is in the rear, because what you had is cooks, you had the transportation units. These were, and I'm not saying less skilled positions, but when you were in the field, Lieutenant White or Lieutenant, help me out here, Young, we didn't have that problem because they understood that we didn't have enough people. We was always under strength. And these guys knew that when you went out, it was every guy and you had to cover the guy's back. So it was never black and white. There was none of this, I've seen it on TV where they're rapping. No, that was not, they cared for each other. Medics didn't care if you were black or white. No one cared. And my thing to my guys was, when they first came, I said, blood is blood. Black guy bleeds the same as us. We will save every guy. We don't have any particulars. And I had no issues. And by 1971, I would say over a third of my platoon and then my company were black, which was about, and plus you had Hispanics. So yeah, the ratio was pretty slanted because they were drafting more kids out of the black areas and they were getting the black guys, not the white guys. And it showed in the rear, but not in the field. Never, I never wrote an Article 15 or had to reprimand anybody in the field. These guys understood what was on, because when I was with the 25th, we went to Cambodia. And when I was with the 101st, we worked the A Shaw, which was still, and we worked right along the Laotian border. And it was pretty bad. So these guys understood. So no, I didn't see that.
Thank you, Rick. Mark Spirdigliozzi, how about you? How are you?
Oh, I'm doing well, Todd. Thank you. I'm sitting here just remembering April 4th, 1968. It was the day I left to go to Vietnam as a 18 and a half year old, and they had walked on the plane just as we were about to take off and announced that, Martin Luther King had been assassinated that day. And I grew up in a very protected Italian neighborhood in Altoona, Pennsylvania, that really didn't have exposure to any Black people or Hispanic or Jewish with all of that. I mean, the prejudice in America didn't start and end with the Blacks. It also happened with the Italians and the Polish and the Irish and everybody that was involved in coming to America under duress, to say the least. But one of the things that I've watched Ken Burns, his program on PBS on Vietnam, and it infuriated me. First, I guess I should set the stage. I'm a combat infantryman from Vietnam who spent a lot of time in the field with everybody that was Black, Puerto Rican, white. It didn't matter. We all defended each other. But I was angry because Ken Burns depicted everybody in Vietnam as being a drugger. And it was infuriating to me. And then not only that, I mean, the prejudice, I think that the prejudice stopped and started at the perimeter fence. I really believe that as people crossed that, they knew that there was nothing. You needed to depend on every person that's there and every person that is with you. That's your life supply. That's getting short. That's how you did it. But the prejudice and the drugs, I didn't experience in Vietnam. I didn't see that at any time. As a matter of fact, as they came on and announced the death of Martin Luther King, we all bowed our head and said a prayer for that and for the country at that point.
Boy, how interesting. Thank you, Mark. What an experience. I do want to say that the Department of or Defense Race Relations Institute still exists under another name. It's now called the Defense Equal Opportunity Management Institute. It's still at Patrick Air Force Base, which I believe now is Patrick Space Force Base, maybe in Eastern Florida. On the Eastern, do you know that, John?
I do not.
I think it's a Space Force Base now.
Yeah.
Here's a recent picture of it. It's called DOMI, the Defense Equal Opportunity Management Institute. We don't get into politics here on the Veterans Breakfast Club because it's so inflammatory and because our politics is so, in our country, is so, of course, polarizing and so partisan, and it would, I think, diminish what we do at the Veterans Breakfast Club, which is focusing on veteran stories and sharing this history. But I do want to bring it up that it still exists. It's still, I think it still does a lot of the work that you or had been doing, a lot of the work that you had been doing, John. I know that diversity, equity, and inclusion has been suspended throughout the Department of Defense under the Trump administration. And so I think DOMI, I think that their operations have been suspended. The classes that they normally teach have been suspended until it can be sorted out what they're exactly teaching. So I do want to, I bring this all up just to say that, everything we're talking about from 50, 60 years ago is still relevant today, and still polarizing and controversial today. So, and I kind of hate to bring it up, but it's because again, we don't talk about politics here, so we can't get too deep into what's going on today. But it's still, these questions are still very much with us, John, and I'm sure you recognize that.
Indeed, yes. Sorry to say, we have a long ways to go, I think.
I want to ask Mark Pizzo, how are you?
I'm doing great. I'm really enjoying this discussion, and brings back a lot of memories. And
how does it?
Well, I think that first of all, I think that the comments about my observation was exactly what a lot of people are talking about. Is that I like the comment of once you leave the perimeter fence that didn't exist. The further away you were from combat or in the field is where I observed most of when the problems happen. And I did bring up in my comments, for instance, the Navy had huge issues of guys that were in the Tonkin Gulf for, a month or longer on those ships. And I remember one on when I was on the Iwo Jima LPH, and we had the film going, and then the lights went out in the hangar deck. We were down the deck, and by the time they got the lights back on, there were chiefs and Marines, everybody down there. I mean, there were chains that the tie-down chains for the helicopters were missing, so on and so forth. So as a lieutenant, they had the staff NCOs and lieutenants actually sit in the ladder wells to make sure that they had overnight observation on the sleeping quarters where Marines or sailors were. And I remember a lot of the Marines would take their mattress, set it in front of them, have their helmet on, and have an e-tool over their shoulder, and that's how they slept. It was nuts. And the other comment I had was when we got into the early 70s, for instance, in Okinawa, I don't think the leadership, they were trying to make good decisions about how to keep calm down. However, I remember there again, when I was in Okinawa, one incident where in the theaters, they would show a movie, and they'd select a movie that was either more white against black or more black against white. And we had the riot squad called out, right, when we needed it. And so I remember one was the Shaft movies.
Yeah, sure.
And so it starts, and it shows this black gal is telling this white guy he can't do her this good and so on. And of course, all the blacks are going, yeah. And then the guy rapes the black gal, and she goes, oh God, that's the best I've ever had. And boom, call out the riot, because then all the whites were on the other side. Yeah, and then boom, it started. And it was just why they would show stuff like that was nuts. So it was a tumultuous time, and it really required solid leadership. And I know the comment, I think there was a comment about the number of blacks that seemed to increase in terms of in the infantry MOSs. Again, I had a platoon of 37, and well over 50% of my troops were black in my platoon. And they were damn good. But my point was that there was a lot of the guys that were in headquarters or in the truck drivers and so on, there were more white Marines there than there were. You saw a significant difference. And so the other thing I just wanted to say that I really enjoyed was a comment about Native American Indians, because I had two, and my favorite guy was his name was Windy Boy, and he was sharp as could be. And a lot of times he would be one, as a very junior enlisted Marine, he'd be one to pull guys together when they saw tensions building, and he'd be able to facilitate getting them to back off. And so
Remarkable.
I was, my experience is funny, but a lot of what I think was key, and you identified it, is the further away you got, you had more problems of drugs, racism, alcohol. And then the other thing, Todd, that you brought out, and I absolutely agree with, is when you think about we had civil rights and the counterculture and the drugs and all of that stuff that was going on in the States. Well, that was coming into the services because a lot of those guys were drafted. And that dynamic really changed from the earlier years, definitely, in my opinion, of those in Vietnam. And that took a lot of, you really had to work strong leadership to be able to keep guys together.
Yeah, strong leadership was called for at that time, and I guess it always is. Bill Dixon.
Question I had, and I'd like for everybody to give me was McNamara Special Soldiers.
Yes.
Yeah.
How they may have figured in race relations. They were uneducated. Some of them couldn't tie their own shoes.
Right.
But they were quite often put out in the infantry because that's one of the things they could teach you how to move that trigger finger.
Right.
When you get somebody like that out there who brings all their prejudices with it, it seems to me like they would cause a unit to really have a struggle sometimes. And I know that McNamara, his book, McNamara's Folly, is out there for people to read. But I think he got it right at 600,000 special soldiers. And to me, the worst part it was that on their 201 file on the cover was written in red letters, special soldiers. So everybody knew they were not educated or illiterate. And that's why they were called quite often morons and so forth. And they were somewhat treated. But they are bound to have caused problems with the units out there.
Absolutely. Yeah. For those of you who aren't familiar with what you're referring to, Bill, I don't know I can't remember the name of the program, but Robert McNamara, our Secretary of Defense.
It was a special troops, special soldiers.
Well, it's McNamara's 100,000.
Yeah, it's known as McNamara's 100,000 or McNamara's Folly.
Yeah.
Or McNamara's Misfits. The idea was to lower the standards for the military in order to meet the demands of the military during the Vietnam War. And it drafted or allowed in huge numbers illiterate soldiers.
Well, the original rules were, even if they couldn't pass, if they couldn't pass the mental test, they had to pass the physical. But they were having problems with these guys even failing the physical. So what they would do was one day, some nice young sergeant would wear their shirt and go through and score high. And that's how they got it passed on, because some of them would recycle 3 or 4 times. They would take somebody at induction center and says, who's got a college education? Somebody's going to raise their hand going, I can get a good job. And they tell him, this guy can't tie his own shoes, but you got to get him through basic training or you're not going to get through.
And Bill, this project was huge. I mean, it was well over 100,000 soldiers.
Well, McNamara came up with the idea, if we make videotapes, even though they can't read, if we make videotapes, they can watch the videotapes and they can learn that way. But nobody ever made the tapes.
And I think a lot of those, the 300,000 or 400,000 who ended up getting drafted or enlisting through this program ended up in Vietnam, and huge numbers ended up dying.
Now, some of them did well. Here's where the problem was, though. The ones survived and came home, they couldn't survive stateside, spit shine. So quite a few of them got a bad discharge, which means they couldn't get the benefits.
Right. They got less than honorable discharges. John Miller, do you know much about this program, McNamara's 100,000?
I've never heard of it. I appreciate Bill bringing it up. I tell you, what it brings to mind is something that is, I think, at the root cause of problems like that, where you've got, it's not just a minority issue, it's a poor person, poor community issue, where you look at how throughout the nation, every single state, how our schools are funded, and they are not equal opportunity schools by any means. You live in a wealthy neighborhood, all that wealth goes into that school system. You live in the poor community, all that poorness is funding the lousy school that you got. And until we look at that as a nation and say, hey, this is not fair. We need to have an equitable system for educating everybody, regardless of your financial circumstances. Until we get to that kind of a level, we're going to perpetuate this same problem forever. And it's a huge problem.
Yes, it is. Hey, I want to remind people this is the Veterans Breakfast Club. We meet every Monday night at 7 p.m. to discuss all things related to the veterans community and military families. We are sponsored by UPMC for Life. We're very grateful to them for helping us keep the lights on here at the Veterans Breakfast Club. They have Medicare programs designed by veterans for veterans. You can learn more about what they offer at upmchealthplan.com/Medicare. That's UPMC Healthcare, healthplan.com/Medicare. I also want to state that we have a huge week coming up here with the Veterans Breakfast Club. I think we have 6 events in the next 5 days. Tomorrow night, we're at the Grist House Brewing in Millvale, PA. Come on out. We'll do the storytelling like we usually do, but in person with craft beer and burgers. What could be better? The next morning, Wednesday morning, we'll be at Christchurch Grove Farm dealing with our hangovers and also sharing more stories here at, we do every couple months or so at in Sewickley at Christchurch Grove Farm. Then Thursday, we'll be at the Heinz History Center in downtown Pittsburgh to talk for Women's Veterans Day, to pay tribute and remember Julia Parsons, our beloved Navy Wave from World War II, who passed away on April 18th at age 104. She was a Navy Wave code breaker. We'll be having speakers remember her and pay tribute to her. And I think there will be a very nice crowd for this event. Then that night, we will mark Women Veterans Day here online with a virtual program with Ash Singer, who has a stage production called In Their Footsteps. And we'll have some of the women portrayed in their footsteps come on and share their stories of service in Vietnam. Then on Flag Day, Saturday, June 14th, we'll have a breakfast in Butler, PA. And then Flag Day night, we're at the ballpark at the Washington Wild Things, which is a Frontier League baseball team here near Pittsburgh. We're having Veterans Breakfast Club night there. Free for veterans, everybody else, $10. Join us if you can. Whew, did I miss anything, Sean? Who the heck scheduled this week? Who's
just everything kind of
today?
fell that way, but it's all good things. All great programming and a wonderful tribute to one of our favorites, Julia Parsons.
Yeah, yeah.
Pat, for those of us who may not be familiar, when was the club, if I can call it that, organization founded?
It was founded in 2008. We had our first breakfast in 2008. So we've been doing this 17 years. Yeah. Holding events where veterans come together to share their stories. And we started going online 5 years ago and doing these virtual programs. And, you know, we published this VBC magazine. I'm a historian and writer, so I like to write up the stories that we hear at our events. And we do some travel. So, for example, our magazine came out in the spring, and I see Daria Summers. She's our managing editor of this wonderful magazine. She helped design the cover and absolutely collected the contents. This spring issue was devoted to the fall of Saigon, and our next issue, which Daria and I are working on right now, is devoted to the 80th anniversary of VJ Day. This will be going to the printer next week It'll be at mailboxes, in mailboxes by July 1st. We send these out to 11,000 mailboxes and then put up another 8,000 for hand distribution. Bill Dixon, if you don't receive this in the mail, it's because we don't have your address. Would love to make sure we send this to you. Bill Dixon, I would also like to send this to you. This is a book, a 25,000 word book. I don't know if you received it or not. If you haven't, I want to make sure that you get it. This is our commemorative history of Vietnam, of the Vietnam War for Vietnam Veterans Day this year.
By the way, Todd, let me put a plug in for that. I just received my copy of that about a week ago. Thank you very much. And that is probably the best, the most complete, thorough history, going back to the French of Vietnam that I've ever seen. It's just really well done. My compliments to the writers.
Thank you. And that, I spent many years teaching a course on the history of Vietnam and history of the Vietnam War. And so I wanted to select from lectures that I thought would be of special value to those who served in that period, who would be able to, relate to some of the history there, and also might be a little unfamiliar with the prehistory.
Right. Very important.
Yeah. The decades before you guys went to Southeast Asia. All right. Do we have any other comments? Do we have any other subjects that you would like to bring up? Because I do have a couple. Rick Weber.
I just want to follow up, Todd. I don't know if any other unit did this, but the 101st did it. Maybe because I was running a recon platoon when I first got there. My first sergeant said, I will pick people for you, but if you have issues with that person, in other words, snoring, going to cause a problem, I had to talk to the first sergeant, and we worked to get that person out of the field. Now, you have to watch and do it delicately because a lot of guys wanted to get out. But where I'm going with this is you're on an LP and you're out there doing an ambush. You can't have guys snoring big time or cough with major coughs or colds or something like that. First sergeant was really good about that. And that was a key, because I have heard where guys in other units would do something to that person to get him out of there. In other words, oh yeah, you don't want people out there that are going to cause an issue. They police themselves. And you talked about drugs. There was only one time that I knew, and it was a medic. And I was with the 25th. We were only gone an hour. And I got a call from my sergeant saying, we need a medevac, sir.
Wow.
And I said, what? And I couldn't believe it. I went back and they beat the crap out of him. And the reason they did that, and they said, sir, when you call the medevac, make sure they put another medic on that plane. They weren't going to have him out there high as a kite. They policed them. These guys understood the rules. When you leave, everybody better have their stuff together. And if you're not, we're going to take care of you.
Mm-hmm.
And, but yeah, and with 101st, though, the first sergeant said, you have somebody out there that's going to cause, not, an issue. It wasn't a race issue. It was that it's going to be causing a problem. We'll get them out of there. So there was no protocol for that. And there was only 3 or 4 guys that, but yeah, we got some pretty guys that couldn't walk or chew gum at the same time. So I just there was a police there, and the men did it. I won't say that the officers did it. The guys, not even the sergeants, the guys would police other guys, just like they do at the academies. And if there's a guy across, they will, take care of them, get them in line.
Seeing you, Rick, reminds me that
yes,
Ed Cottrell's burial has been scheduled for Saturday, June 21st at 1:30 p.m. His daughter asked me that I pass this along because it's in Union City, PA, which is up north near Meadville, maybe near Slippery Rock.
It is. It's a little bit north of Slippery Rock.
North Slippery Rock towards Erie, PA. That's where Ed grew up. That's where his wife is buried. And Ed, who passed away last month at age 103, is being buried on Saturday, June 21st at 1:30 p.m. And his daughter wants to make sure that anybody who wants to attend should attend. And I'll put the link to here, the burial information here in the chat. Dave Seaver, how are you?
I'm good. How are you this evening?
I'm doing very well.
Good. I apologize. I was late to the party. I was over at the neighbor's house for dinner, but I found the discussion, being in the military 50 years or so later than some of these veterans on here, very interesting, because if this is a parade, I got to apologize. I'm going to be a little bit of a rainstorm here. That was not my experience in my 20 years.
What was not your experience?
The racism and the problems. I have served, 4 deployments, different environments, different folks, exercises, you name it. And I can never recall one issue with racism. And maybe I was just fortunate and I didn't have my eyes open enough. I don't know, but that was not my experience. But I do remember, I was in 2022, I was the med group commander for ROTC field training, and I had a pretty diverse group of medics there. And my number 2 was actually a major. He was a nurse from Buckley. And so as a major, he's looking at being a commander at some point. And I remember one day he just point blank asked me, he said, "Sir, how do you just deal with all this stuff?" And so I reminded him of an email that I had sent out to the people that were assigned to me before they got down there to Alabama. And I said, I have 3 expectations. Number 1, and I put it in capital letters, was be on time. Number 2 was wear the uniform correctly. And number 3 was do your job to the best of your ability. And I said, the reason I have those out there is because anybody can do that. It doesn't matter who you are, where you're from, who your daddy was, who your mom was. It doesn't matter. Those are things that anybody can do. And if we can meet those basic expectations, we'll get along.
How wonderful. I do think Americans who have lost faith in a lot of our institutions still hold the military in very high regard. And one of those reasons, I think, is because the military is more racially integrated than civilian society, than the civilian world. And I think that I from what I've seen and from what I've heard from veterans and also what I've read in terms of polling, is there's less racial or ethnic conflict in the military than there is outside of the military. So
Yeah.
you served, Dave, during a time when I think the military was doing an exceptionally good job with.
Yeah, and war on terror. So that was my conflict, so to speak. A pretty protracted one, if you will. But I never saw any of that kind of stuff going on. I do have to back up Rick on the snoring, because I remember on my first deployment we had an Army guy who had to be medevac because he had sleep apnea. And the facility we were in was a very nice facility, but it was basically a concrete shell. And this guy snored so loud he put a freight train to shame. And the next morning, every other guy and gal that was in that facility was like, "You son of a bitch." They were like, "You kept us up all night." And he's like, "I know, I'm sorry, but yeah, I understand where he's coming from. That could be a problem, but
Especially
yeah,
when you're outside
again,
the
I just never ran into any of that on any sort of any level at all.
Thank you, Dave.
Sure.
Anyone else? Any other subjects anybody want to bring up? Because there is something I do want to bring up. Rich Kensinger.
Thank you for recognizing me. By now, you know I'm a clinical psychologist. I was an Air Force ER medic. So I'm both enlightened and troubled by this topic because I am so worried right now about our current military. When we talk about unison, we are becoming divided. As a country, we're becoming divided. Based on my clinical observations, we are experiencing right now an ongoing, deteriorating second civil war. And I'm really, you talk about how integrated the military should be, how this country should be, it's being torn apart. So I have a passion about this. I've devoted myself to helping people, saving people, like David. This tearing down really bothers me. I do appreciate the topic, but I'm not going to remain quiet about the consequences that are happening now to our military. God forbid they go into a combat zone.
Yeah, we are in a hugely conflicted time. We're in a time of, great social conflict. I think we all see that and agree on that, Rich. It is beyond the purview of our programs to address it directly, but I certainly think that these conversations that delve into the history and times, like what we have now, do help shed light. And the other thing is, John, you mentioned John Miller. You mentioned toward the beginning of your talk here that one of the things that you did is kind of compel or force your students to state the other side's perspective or position, make the best case for the opposing side that you possibly can. And I remember learning to do that years ago, and how powerful that is, how difficult that is, and how transformative it is. And I still practice it today, very, very, very much. Because I'm, somebody who's collecting a lot of different points of view, many of them are new to me, many of them I don't quite understand or don't agree with. And I do compel myself, often it's just to myself, to kind of frame their argument make the best case I could possibly make for their side, their view of the issue. And I have found that it's really helpful to keep me honest, so that I don't get lazy and go down an ideological path that may not reflect reality. But it also, I think, makes me understand other perspectives better. So I think it's a really powerful,
thank you.
Exercise.
That's so important. And we another thing we did besides the role plays was we let people write down questions they've always wanted to ask a member of another racial ethnic group. And I have some, if we had another hour, I could share with you. I saved about 8 or 9 pages of those questions from our classes 50 years ago, just because it was so fascinating to me what kinds of, anonymous questions they wanted to have addressed,
Well, John, I hate to tell you all, but veterans are their own demographic also.
Right.
And you guys are weird.
Absolutely.
You're different. You think differently, I think, than those who haven't served. I have a tough time understanding you all the time. And that little exercise that I do, it's mainly about you. It's mainly to figure out, like, I'm very, very serious about that. That it took me a long time, for example, to understand how some veteran could experience combat, really hard, scary time, and yet remember it as a positive thing in their life. That doesn't make any sense to me. And yet it took me a long time talking to a lot of veterans and kind of struggling to see it from their point of view, that it dawned on me that I could absolutely see why that is the case for so many.
Yeah.
And I could also now begin to see, and I'm sorry, Rick Weber, I'm just going to call you out on this. I remember Rick when I first met him. I hope I'm not disclosing something you want to be disclosed, but I remember you telling me, like, I hated the Army. I hated the Army. And yet, look in his background. You can see he has Army memorabilia there. He's one of the greatest volunteers and leaders of the Veterans Breakfast Club we have, and greatest connectors with other veterans that we have. And so, for somebody who hated the Army, you sure have Army blood running through your veins, Rick. And that's interesting to me.
I did not like the Army. I didn't like it. I was drafted out of law school, so that was, my wife's still upset about that. I certainly did not want to be in the infantry in Vietnam, and that's all happened. But when I got there, I really believe, and this is like a Harry Van Ripert thing, I was put in the right place by the right person. And my job was not to win the war. My job was to get these kids home. And we talked about it. Every kid, I mean, when I'm talking kids, I was 23, then I was 24, and they're calling me dad. And they were 17, 18-year-old kids, 19-year-old kids. I did not have any sergeants over an E5 in the field. They were all young guys. And they say to me, "What are you doing here, sir?" And I said, "Well, I'm just like you." And I used some flowery languages. I said, "I was drafted like you," and I told them, and I said, and they said, "Well, why are you an officer?" And I said, "Because I can't live on $72 a month." And they understood that. And I said, and they said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, I'm going home. That's my job. I'm going home, and I'm going to take all of you with me. So if you do what you're supposed to do, I said, I can't promise you're going to go home the same way your mother sent you, but I will make sure you get home. And that's the only promise that I kept, that we didn't lose. There was nobody missing in action. So, and these guys understood that. And they had, they understood when they were there. When you're in the infantry and you're out there, you're all alone. And so sharing a foxhole with a guy is one of the greatest things you can do, because you learn everything about these guys. And so to answer your question, yeah, I'm not a big military guy. I don't, I never went to a reunion until about 2002. But the greatest guys that I know were Vietnam veterans, because we all have one thing in common. We had to overcome and adapt, because we were ill-treated by the military, and we were certainly ill-treated by the country. So that's changed. And I'm proud to be in a military. But if I had to, if I had my druthers, I'd have been staying home and being in law school. So, but yes. And one thing I did learn in the military is, probably in the very beginning, especially through OCS, first day, we had a battalion commander. Captain walked up and said, "I just shot him. He's dead." Next guy comes up, he shot your guy. And he said, "So who's taking over?" And people just won't. So yeah, the next guy up. So I'm proud of what these guys did. These kids did really good in the field, really good. Black, white, Hispanic. These kids, 18-year-old kids, there's nothing better than watching 18-year-old kids pissed off and with full automatic weapons. They go, because they have no fear. Whereas, you got to keep them under control. But so God bless all these kids and the kids that are active out there now. I mean, it's a little different. Most of these people are full military. What I mean by full military, they're making a career out of it, just like John did. That was never my path. Right. And the guy that I went in with, Colonel Joe, 27 years, and we went in the same day. We were friends before we went in. and I couldn't wait to get out.
Yeah,
and he stayed in 27 years.
Right.
It's totally different. I told him, I said to him, God bless G.I. Joe, because its birthday's coming up on Saturday. But yeah, so it's totally different personalities. As you know, Joe doesn't say 5 words.
You say more than 5, Rick. You say about 5,000.
Oh, I say I'm limited now to 20,000 a day.
Very good. All right, Rick.
But I appreciate it. But like I said, I love the vets, and can't do enough for them. And I will say this: John mentioned about how you do the writing. Todd is the best communicator and the best organizer that this country has, and this is the best show in town by far.
I love what I do, Bob.
I know you do, and you do it extremely well.
I love you guys.
And the people you get on, just fantastic. You don't have a clue how good you are. You don't.
These conversations make my life. I mean, I find these totally fascinating. I find veterans and their stories absolutely absorbing. I just, I love every minute of it. Bob Flage, you get the last word. How are you?
Thank you. I'm very good. Thank you. Hearing leadership comments brings 2 of my main principles that I had. The first week I was in my unit, I was appointed as a squad leader. And the 2 principles that I still have today was anybody that I had to, was a leader of, I was friendly but not familiar. I did not want other people in the squad thinking, hey, he's got a buddy, he's not going to walk point because he's close, whatever, as far as that goes. And the other principle was I would not ask or tell them to do anything I would not do. I think I got more respect from that, than because I ended up walking point probably most of the time. I had a couple platoon leaders saying, well, I don't want you up there, Anyway, I stayed up there, and like I say, those 2 things I think helped me get, tight with all of my men.
Thank you, Bob. And speaking of leadership, John, maybe you'd like to come back sometime and talk about the Air Force core values and how they change your life. The values of honor, service, and excellence in everything you do. Those were instilled in you at the Air Force Academy, and I'd love to hear how they play out in actual life and in the choices that you've made. So thank you all. Thank you, John, for coming and sharing your story. Thanks to the rest of you for being part of the conversation. I hope to see you maybe tomorrow night at Grist House Brewing, or Thursday night online. We'll be back here again at 7 p.m. Good night, everybody.
Very good. Good night. Thank you much, everybody.
Real quick,
for sharing.
Joe Griffey's, remind everybody that Saturday, remember our vets in hospitals and homes.
Amen.
They deserve a